The Golden State Warriors are the defining team of the last decade in the NBA. So many iconic teams, so many iconic players. They've won 4 titles at a 7-year gap in between titles, which is just not supposed to happen. But now it's kind of just over, which is weird because they won the title in 2022, which is not very long ago at all. But last year they were the 10 seed in the West. They didn't even make the playoffs. And now their team is just getting worse, which makes me wonder, what exactly is the plan? Where do the Warriors go from here? Because if you look at the last 2 off seasons for Golden State, they're basically just getting rid of guys to save money. You go back to last year, they trade away Jordan Poole and a first-round pick, by the way, to get back Chris Paul in a move that at the time seemed like, okay, Chris Paul is going to help this team. He still has something left to give. But really, it was just about saving money. It was getting out of the Jordan Poole contract that they signed a year before. And then this offseason, they just cut Chris Paul for nothing. They explored trade options. Nobody wanted him. Nobody wanted the expiring contract. So they just cut him once again to save money. And then they just lose Klay Thompson for basically nothing. So in a span of 12 months, they lose Jordan Poole, Chris Paul, and Klay Thompson for like a couple of second-round picks, which if you're a team that's trying to win the title is just not what you do. You don't just lose players for the sake of saving money. Or I should say, that isn't what teams used to do. Now they absolutely do. The Nuggets lose Kentavious Caldwell-Pope for nothing. They just lose him in free agency. The Clippers just let Paul George walk because teams are worried about the second apron. They're worried about massive payroll spending. And the Warriors, after years of being the most expensive roster in the entire league, after winning the title in 2022 and extending Jordan Poole, extending Andrew Wiggins, have now made a decision to go in the opposite direction. And then you look at their offseason this year and it's just weird. They lose Klay on a contract that wasn't even that big. You can look at the list of guys that are making more than Klay Thompson next season in terms of average annual value. And then they go out and get Kyle Anderson, DeAnthony Melton. They're signing and trading for Buddy Hield. And they're doing all that. They're saving money by getting rid of Poole, CP3, and Klay in the span of a year. But then they're also bringing in guys like Kyle Anderson to be what? The 9th, 10th best team in an absolutely loaded Western Conference. And it just puts them in a weird spot. I don't think people realize Steph Curry is 36 years old. He's a 2026 free agent. And obviously they want to continue to put a good team around him. They don't want Steph to go anywhere else. They're going to try and put at least a decent team around him for the last few years of his career. But at this point, given the moves that they've made since winning the title in 2022, they've basically just committed to being something that they've never really been, and that is just a completely forgettable team. And all of these moves are extremely easy to criticize. They could have just paid Klay. They could have kept Chris Paul. They could have tried to make all these moves. They've tried to trade for Paul George. They've tried to trade for Lauri Markkanen, and they were unsuccessful. And it's very easy to be critical of those moves. But the real answer to why this is happening, why their future looks the way that it does, is that this isn't supposed to happen. You're not supposed to be the San Antonio Spurs that are good for over 2 decades and bridge the gap between a title in 2000 and then still competing for titles in the mid 2010s. Like, that's just not the way the NBA works. You get expensive, you get old, and then you reset. And that's especially true in this new era of the NBA that we're in. With all these new rules with the second apron, it's going to be so much more difficult to have sustained periods of success. And for the Warriors, a team that is just never going to get rid of Steph, and they shouldn't, by the way, it makes them just an average team by default. And it's strange because they won the title just 2 years ago, and at the time it seemed like they were going to continue to be good. They re-signed Jordan Poole. They re-signed Andrew Wiggins. They brought back Draymond last year, and they could have brought back Klay this year. And if they bring back all of those guys, that's the team that won the title in 2022. But it almost seems like the league has passed the Warriors by. And obviously the Warriors and their fans would always take winning the title in 2022. You would never take that back. But if they don't win that title, if they lose in the second round of the playoffs, do they bring back Jordan Poole? Do they bring back Andrew Wiggins? Do they sign those guys to massive contracts? And if they don't, are they able to retain someone like Klay Thompson this offseason and at least keep that core together? And so now you look at the future of the team, you look at the payroll sheet, you look at the players that they have, and there are some promising pieces. Jonathan Kuminga is very good. They're still very high on Moses Moody. Podziemski is going to be a really good player for them. They've done well in the draft last year and then a few years prior in the Kuminga draft, but they've done just well enough that there's no real clear path forward for them. There's a couple of options. They could just kind of take this year as a gap year, be average, and then try and shed some salary, maybe add some guys. Maybe there's a new version of the Paul George trade for them next year, not specifically with Paul George, but with somebody where they're able to add another guy alongside Steph. Maybe they trade away Andrew Wiggins in a year. Maybe they trade away Draymond in a year and they completely reset. But the problem with all of this, and I think the point that people continue to miss about the Warriors, about their future, about what's next, is they're never getting rid of Steph. He's never asking out. And it's not like he's 32 years old. He's 36 years old. And at this point, we've seen it with LeBron as he gets closer to 40. It's just going to be unbelievably difficult to build the kind of team around someone like Steph that you're going to need to in order to build a championship contender when the guy is approaching 40 years old and he's making $50 to $60 million a year. And so I say all of this to say, as much as people are going to be critical of Golden State, they're going to say, well, they could have made this move. They shouldn't have re-signed Poole. They shouldn't have re-signed Wiggins. This is where they're at now. They've had one of the most successful decade-long runs that the NBA has ever seen. And you're just simply not supposed to be able to sustain that, even before this new CBA, even before the second apron. There's no team other than the Spurs, basically, that have ever been able to maintain a more than 2-decade-long run of success, of championship-level success in NBA history. It just does not happen. It doesn't matter how good your players are. You get old, you get expensive, and you can't replace the talent. And this Warriors team has done as good of a job as most teams ever could. They were helped by the Kevin Durant thing. They were helped by the salary cap spike. But then they even proved all of that stuff wrong by managing to win the title in 2022 as well. A 7-year gap between titles, 4 titles in 10 years is just not supposed to happen. What is supposed to happen is what is happening right now to Golden State. So be critical of what they're doing if you want. Say that the future is sad, as I've said in this video, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it is the Warriors' fault. There are moves that they could have made. There are things that they could have done better, but there's nothing that you can say that is going to take away anything from the last 10 years of Warriors basketball. And so as weird as it is, the rest of Steph's career, unless something changes dramatically, is just going to be him being on pretty good teams. If he stays in Golden State, they're not going to be contenders. They're not going to be anything close to that. They're going to be the 9th or 10th best team in the conference. And until he gets frustrated with that, which feels unlikely, this is just his destiny now. It's the way that it's supposed to go. And in an era of star players requesting trades and constantly trying to go to better situations, Steph is just different in that way. And he has been different in that way throughout his career. And it's going to create a very strange ending to his career. But ultimately, this is just what happens. And I think we forget that sometimes. There's so much pressure on these guys to be in contention, to be winning titles. There's so much pressure on these franchises to put the best players in the league, which Steph certainly still is up there, in position to win titles all the time. If you're a top 10, a top 15 guy, you're supposed to be pushing for a title. That's just the way things are. And we forget that that isn't how it used to be. Players used to go out like this. They used to go out on teams that weren't very good. They didn't request trades to all these random teams. They didn't push their way to somewhere else to try and get one more title when they're 35 years old. And maybe Steph will do that. Maybe in a year or two, he'll be on a different team, which would be unbelievably strange. But everything that we know about the guy tells us that that is not going to happen. And I think you could argue that that's actually a better way, a more admirable way for his career to end. And you can call it a dynasty, you can call it whatever you want to, but this is truly the end of an era for Golden State.